Hi, Isabel. I am very privileged to meet you today and have a discussion with you. Mr. Hayder from GreenCape heard you when you presented at the Sustainable Seas Trust presentation, and he was very impressed with your discussion. And then he thought maybe I should have the discussion with you. I'm the research chair in Waste and Society, and part of what we do is to understand human behavior and waste, and why people litter, why people do illegal dumping. And he thought this might be a good way of bringing you into the discussion and that we can have your ideas of what you presented. So maybe we can start the discussion to ask you that maybe you introduce yourself a little bit to us. And I would like to know how you got to study human behavior and the environment.
Yeah, it's lovely to meet you, and thank you for inviting me. I am an environmental psychologist, as you already said. I work at the University of Plymouth, and I collaborate with loads of projects around the world. Many of them are in Southeast Asia, but also some are in Africa, in Namibia, in Tanzania, and in other places in the world. And the reason why I'm interested in that is that when I started studying psychology, I realized that knowledge does not necessarily predict behavior, no matter if that's in the health sector or in other areas. And I thought that's actually also very relevant for the environment, because we often know so much. We know it's not good for the environment to litter. We know it's not good for the environment to drive a big car. But knowledge alone does not necessarily lead to good behavior, because there are so many other drivers, like the social norms, or what the neighbor says, or what our ego says. And then I got really intrigued to study, what does psychology actually have to say about the environment, about why we behave the way we do, despite us knowing so much already. That's how I got into that.
Yes, I think the complexity of human behavior, I think is the thing that fascinates us, because there's no one silver bullet answer, I think, to people. So would you like to share some of your ideas and some of your theory about human behavior and the complexity of human behavior?
Yeah, that would be lovely. I will share my screen and talk a little bit about human behavior and complexity, and then we can continue our discussion. So I'm sharing my screen now. I think you can see that one, correct?
Yes, I can see it. Thank you very much.
Lovely. So environmental psychology, as I said already, is about the relationship between humans and nature. And as an environmental psychologist, I look at this relationship from both angles. I look at it like how nature affects us. When you think about, you walk in a city, and the city is maybe there are lots of trees, and the noise is managed really well, and it's a nice sunny day, you might feel really good. And especially walking in a park, like the air is good and so on. But compared to that, you walk in a city that is really busy. Maybe the air is polluted, there are lots of cars, lots of people, it's really loud. Your stress levels go up, and you might get a little bit anxious, and you feel tense. And if you repeat that over many days, your stress levels never come down. And this is what we environmental psychologists also look at. How does the environment and maybe city planning, or how does being near the ocean or on a beach affect our health and well-being? But then we also look at the other side. How do we affect nature? What kind of difference does it make if I choose to use my reusable cup as compared to a plastic cup? Or what difference does it make if I drive a big car versus a small car, or if I choose to ride a bike? What does this mean in terms of carbon emissions, for example? And as an environmental psychologist, we also look at the choice process, like why do we behave the way we do? What are the drivers behind behavior, and so on? And why do we sometimes do the bad thing for the environment, even if we know that it's bad. And in terms of plastic, you might think like, what does actually human behavior have to do with plastic pollution? And yeah, it has to do a lot with plastic pollution. You see the whole plastic life cycle here on the right-hand side, with the production on the top, and where the raw material is taken and made into plastics in different sectors, like in automotive sector. There are lots of parts in cars that are made from plastic, or cosmetics and retail and so on. Then the second bit is the consumer in the middle, like consumer decisions, choosing plastic or not choosing plastic. And then on the bottom, there's the environment, and there wouldn't be any plastic in the environment normally. However, there are loads of decisions and behaviors that lead to plastic ending up in the environment, and that's the red arrows in this graph. So all the red arrows lead to plastic ending up in the environment. That can be businesses deciding to use plastic as a certain material for their cars, in agriculture, or in cosmetics. That's consumers deciding to choose or not to choose plastic bags or plastic packaging. And then accidentally or non-accidentally, plastic ends up in the environment. You also see that there are some blue arrows. Those point towards plastic being recovered from the environment. So decisions and behavior can also lead to plastic being taken back from the environment by beach cleans, or maybe plastic can be reused and recycled and be put back into the system on the top. So decisions and behavior actually are present in the whole life cycle of plastic. And behavior is very complex because it is driven by a whole range of factors. So for example, emotions. Very often we don't really think about our behavior before we behave. We just act on an emotion. We feel good if we do that. Or it's a habit. We just do it every single day. So we don't really think about it. It's an automatic behavior. And very often you think that, or you hear, if we just tell people that there's a problem, then they will change their behavior. But all the environmental psychology research, unfortunately, shows that knowledge alone is not enough. So simply telling people that there's a problem won't lead to behavior change. However, what we can do if we want to change behavior and make it a little bit less complex is that we identify a specific behavior. That's the key step number one. So instead of saying, I want to solve plastic pollution, you have to identify what is the specific behavior. Is it illegal dumping in this particular village, for example? Or is it burning of waste in that particular area? What is the behavior that I want to focus on? Then what are the behavioral drivers that I want to focus on? Is it people don't know better? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the norms? What is it exactly that drives people to perform this behavior? And in order to find out what is the driver, you have to get to know the audience. You have to get to know the people living in this village, talk to them, and co-develop the solutions with them. And by this, you can unravel the complexity of behavior a little bit. I will unshare my screen now, and then we can have a little talk about it maybe.
Thank you very much for that. I think my one question is also that I would like to know, or my experience is also that all those dimensions that you're talking about are actually interrelated. So it is seldom that we will focus only on the habits, or that we only focus on the emotions, or that we focus on that. So I think the interrelation, can you maybe speak a bit about how they work as a system? Because a person is a system that consists of all these dimensions.
Yeah, that's very true. Our behavior is always predicted or driven by actually all those factors at once, but some of them are stronger than others in certain moments. And in psychology, we really like statistics. So we try to measure all the different factors. And what we then do is try to see which one is the strongest in order to change behavior and to identify the main factor. So usually we end up doing big statistical analysis, and then one or two factors might turn out stronger than others. And interestingly, if you run the same analysis on a different behavior or with a different group, probably one or two other factors turn out the strongest. So yeah, it is very complex, and you're very right. It is never one factor that is always the strongest. It's usually a mix of them, and yeah, it changes from person to person as well.
And I think what is also the difficulty is what you've said there is, I think what is important to realize is not one person is the same as the other person. And I think the one community is different from the next community. So if we find that in this community, these are the main drivers of their behavior, that's not what we're going to find in the next community. I think every community should be looked at differently and should be explored totally different in different ways.
Yes.
Because the circumstances are different, the context within which, and this is maybe where my focus is a lot on that. I'm not a psychologist, I'm more in community development and social work. I'm coming from a social work background and in the developing context. So I think the context for me is very important. Just to give you a simple idea, in one community where we're working, nappies is a major issue in that community. So my one question was to ask the people, is it possible that we can work with cloth nappies? And they said no, because they don't have water. So as simple as that, so this is not a solution to think of anything. And I think as an outsider, I would have thought maybe cloth nappies might be a solution, but when you get there, then you realize it's totally not something that you could think of.
Yeah.
So, and I think that brings me to where we want to, you've ended your presentation with that. So can we talk a little bit about change and the complexity of change, and then how do we facilitate such a change process? Because I think we've seen if it's a complex thing that we're working a complex system, then our answers are not going to be simple.
No.
How do we facilitate a process like this? Because I think this is very important for all of us, to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I want to emphasize the most is that change making and solution development is never happening without people, and always happens, as you said, like every village, every community, every group is very different. And I will share my screen for a little bit again and put a little bit of light on that from a psychology perspective. So what does psychology or environmental psychology say about this change process? And it is always about identifying this little sweet spot in between what behaviors are easy and which behaviors have a big impact. As an example, a very easy behavior, just from my personal life, would be switching on and off the light. However, that behavior doesn't have a really big impact. A behavior that is probably difficult for many people would be completely changing the diet and going vegan. That would be great for the environment, but it is very difficult. A behavior that is maybe somewhere in between and still has a decent impact would be taking the bicycle instead of the car for most of my trips. So that's a bit about like, where is the sweet spot? That's a field example. So I was collaborating with a whale watching company on a Portuguese island, and they also wanted to do something about plastic, because when they went out on the boat every day, they saw lots of plastic pollution in the ocean, and they wanted to look at this also together with me from a psychological angle. We sat together and we discussed what can we do about the plastic. And in this discussion, it turned out that many tourists that enter the island don't know that the water in these islands is very, very clean, perfectly drinkable. And then it happens that all the tourists buy these little small 0.5 water bottles. However, these small islands don't have a good recycling system. So what happens if millions of tourists arrive in the island and all of them buy several of these little water bottles and drink about 5 or 10 of them a day because it's hot? So all these little bottles end up in the environment, and not many of them will be recycled. So the approach was to encourage the tourists, probably also during the whale watching, when they are in a good mood, they are on holidays, they are fascinated by the whales, to encourage them to refill their bottles, because that's a powerful behavior. Like one refill of the bottle already saves one plastic bottle. So that was the behavior that we identified as the sweet spot in that case. There's also a report done by Earthwatch that looks at the most littered items in the UK, and they line out all the possible solutions and evaluate the pros and cons. So that's a little bit about the sweet spot again. And in terms of the options that we are talking about here, potentially in South Africa, like what is the best option? Where is the sweet spot? Is it burning waste, burying waste? Is it recycling? Is it reusing the plastic? So it's again like talking about the sweet spot here and thinking about where, like what behavior is best, what is most feasible and impactful at the same time. And then we want to communicate with people. And interestingly, every single audience needs a different way of communication, and different behaviors need a different way of communication again. So yeah, it's never easy. We always have to collaborate with people. And in a recent study, we found that those 7 criteria, they are very important. All of them are very important. But in a recent study, we found that emotional and solution-focused communication is actually the most impactful. And I will stop sharing my screen in a second, but we have to remember, always think about who your target group is. Are we talking to parents? What do they care about? They probably care about their children, the safety of their children, the health of their children. Students, probably they want to belong, they want to be cool, they want to be part of the group. Tourists, they want to have a good time. They don't really want to think about money. They want to, because they are only on holidays maybe once a year, so they want to have it as easy and convenient as possible. Policymakers often are encouraged by monetary drivers, so what is in for them, and so on. So always think about what is in for your target audience, what are common narratives that are told, what language do they use, what language do they understand. So yeah, that's what research has to say about different audiences and participatory methods.
I think the critical question for me, thank you very much for that, because I think that's the critical thing, is that we need to get engaged with the communities. We need to sit, but it's just we have, I think, 2 minutes left. So let's just engage a bit about what is participatory work. Sort of how do we engage with the community? Because I think that's the critical thing. It's easy to use the word and we say we participate with the community, and then you organize a meeting and you ask, you ask questions or whatever. But what is real participation, if we talk about that? Because I think for me that's the critical issue.
I would say participatory is mainly about listening, and about going back again and again. So it's not going into a community and having your solution already. It is about listening to what they want and discussing what is possible, supporting them to find the solution instead of bringing the solution with you already. And probably after you implemented a potential solution, go back and find out, does it even work? Are there problems? Maybe we have to tweak something, change something. So it's totally right. I think participatory does not mean having one meeting and ticking a box and saying, it was participatory.
Yes. And I think what is also important in terms of the list that you've given, I think it also asks us maybe to use different ways of that participation. Actually, you can walk the streets, you can ask people to listen, but sometimes you have to sit, you have to draw, you have to map, you can use these wonderful participatory techniques that we can use. I think there's a whole history of people that developed those type of techniques. And I think it is something that we can really focus on and try and really understand what's happening in communities. If you go to a village or to a town, actually we don't know anything about it. So how are we going to find out what's going on and what is important in terms of their concerns and what are the real issues that are happening there and what is driving their behavior, to understand that?
Absolutely. We had a couple of studies on that in Southeast Asia, and we encouraged with communities in many different ways. And some of them wrote a song about it, some of them were drawing, some of them did a comic book, and we evaluated as well, how does this encourage behavior? How does this encourage their behavioral intentions? And we found that all these participatory methods are highly effective, because some people might think, oh, this is just a little game, people are drawing sustainability pictures. It's not. There's so much knowledge in them, and the solutions, and it's a process where people sit down and actually think about the problem that is so much deeper than an hour-long discussion. So yeah, I highly value these participatory methods that you just mentioned as well.
And I think that's when we talk about the real awareness. Is if people sometimes discover their own way of thinking, and they discover their own drivers, sort of why they're doing what they're doing, that type of thing. I think then that's a real awareness on some level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I think our time is up. So thank you very much for this. Let's open the floor and hear what people have to say and ask us questions.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what kind of questions are coming.
Thank you everyone for attending this session, and I'd like to welcome Prof. Schenk and Dr. Richter to this question session. I think it was a very interesting discussion and very interesting insights in terms of looking at human behavior. And with your background in environmental psychology, the research that you've done on applying theories for behavior change, I think, was highlighted as important in the previous discussion as well. And Prof. Schenk, with your experience as the HOD of Department of Social Work at the University of the Western Cape and Geneva, and I think a very important role as the DSI NRF Chair in Waste and Society. I think the previous discussion that showed that you have a really important role in how we progress in terms of how we manage waste sustainably. Just going to the first question from the audience, comparing behavior, whether it's an individual, business, or municipality, can be an important mechanism for behavior change. Do you think there are benefits to dashboards that, e.g., compare municipal performance in waste management? Or do you think there's a danger in naming and shaming? So do you think having these dashboards will incentivize municipalities to do better? Or there's a risk that you'll have a negative outcome instead?
Sorry, Tawanda, I couldn't hear you very clearly, but so was the question that you asked it to me?
I think it applies strongly towards Dr. Richter's background. But if you got any comments, I would like to hear your thoughts as well, Prof. Schenk. But Dr. Richter, did you hear the message, the question?
Well, I think dashboards like this would be something like the first step. It is really interesting to see who is, for example, most responsible for the waste. If there's a way of quantifying the different contributions, like most contributor is, for example, the manufacturer, but then there are also the citizens. So if you could quantify that, that's interesting. but just putting up a dashboard without further messages around the dashboard, so basically just naming and shaming the responsibles, I don't think that goes anywhere, because people will just put their backs up and say, well, what can I do about it? So I would say we have to go one step further. If we want to put a dashboard up that names and shames responsibles, we have to also co-develop solutions together with these responsibles. So yeah, it is kind of the first step. Where is the intervention most powerful? But it shouldn't be used on isolation, I think.
Can I come in here? I want to agree with Isabel, because I think we first need to understand what is the problems they experience in the municipality, for instance, or in the business. It might be skills, it might be money, it might be political interference. Actually, there are a host of issues that municipalities experience, and I think we cannot just do a dashboard, but before we do that, we need to see where can we support, where can we do that in terms of before we do a naming and shaming. I think a naming and shaming on its own is not going to work.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And the second question touches onto the previous presentation. I'm not sure if you saw that one. So there was the introduction of Moloch at Stellenbosch municipality, which seems like a fantastic idea. So you've got these underground bins, these bins that have got 2/3 of the volume underground and 1/3 above the ground. So it's nice and big, seemingly easy to use, but it ended up being a total failure the first time around. So people burned them. People thought they were spy units that were placed there by the municipality. So in your case, do you have any examples on where something like this, which is actually a good initiative, but maybe there was not enough engagement with the public, or something went wrong? Do you have any cases on how to turn around some of these things? Because I think South Africa is sitting in a space where we tried some fantastic things, they failed, and now we don't want to go there again.
That really refers to the conversation we had last time, I think, me and Professor Schenk. I guess that the key here is to really bring the communities on board, or key stakeholders, key community members, and to think carefully in a group and collaboratively what would be a good solution. And then when you decide for one solution, not stop there, but have reiterations, like go back to the group meeting, see, does it actually work? Are there problems? Do we have to tweak something? So people often say participatory methods or participatory problem solving. And yeah, we had a stakeholder meeting, but the problem is if you only do it once and then you put in your solution and then you leave people alone with it, maybe it doesn't work. So you have to constantly, yeah, go back and forth and maybe change something and then go forward again. So it's always, yeah, a process, I guess.
Yes, I want to support what you're saying, because I think this is often the problem. I think that we think this is the solution. It's a good waste solution, but it's maybe not a good solution for that particular community, or we didn't engage the community. They don't understand how it works, what works. I think it's important for people to feel that they participate, that they can take care of it, or that they feel there's some responsibility for them to do that. So I think we need to sit down with the communities and see how do they view this. Sometimes we think a solution, but the solution becomes a problem. So we need that constant engagement with the community is very important.
Okay. Thank you again for those responses. And I guess we'll take one more question, and this is a bit provocative. So looking at the value chain, I'm going to paraphrase the question. Looking at the value chain, it's easier to deal with one entity or one company than deal with, we're talking about 55 or 60 million consumers in South Africa. So the question was, given a limited amount of effort that we can spend, should we rather be focusing way upstream? So maybe putting things like banning the import of additional plastic bottles to encourage the reuse of plastic bottles. So you will not throw it away because you know you will not be able to refill your water, for example, rather than trying to stop the public from littering. So I guess this question is saying, given the limited resources that we have, what should we rather focus on?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. Yeah, it really goes back to the circular economy approach of motivating people to reuse and also go from the production stage. And because, yeah, it's totally correct. The consumer is basically at the end of the whole chain, like the consumer is using and then potentially reusing or recycling or littering, but the plastic is produced like somewhere else, and we have to stop this flow if we want to stop the litter in the end. So yeah, I would say, of course, everything is very important, and we have to start working on all these like stations in the life cycle of plastic. And if there would be something like reduced amount of import of plastics, that would be a very strong lever as well for the producers, because they would have to rethink as well and rethink about other materials. Or so I think it would be a very strong lever, but there's of course a lot of money and interests behind it as well. Yeah, as a psychologist, it's very difficult to answer because my main interest is the individual behavior. What do you think, Professor Schenk? Would that be an idea, or?
Yes, no. I fully agree with your answer. I cannot actually extend that. I was just thinking, maybe Tawanda, if we can address the question, it relates to the previous one. Maybe Isabel, you can have some ideas about that. I think question 3 was quite a relevant question as well. Of residents of informal settlements often see the municipality as the enemy and hence are often quite hostile to the officials. And I think that's maybe an important one just to have a quick idea on, Isabel, if you want to share something.
That's definitely a difficult one as well. I remember work in Malaysia that we had where there are also informal settlements off the coast, and they are basically also, it's a two-way process. Not only do the informal settlers see the municipalities as their enemies, but also the municipalities and the official citizens see them as enemies. So it is not, I don't think anyone is in particular to blame, and having a more inclusive approach and actually giving these people formal settlement rights, for example, and including them on a legal basis would maybe help to, yeah, bring them on board with accepting the rules as well. So having them as informal and non-existing people there, so to say, without rights, without like proper sanitation, I don't think that helps their acceptance of rules really, because they are really pushed to the corner of society. And yeah, working on bringing them into society, I think, would help to increase their acceptance as well.
Yes, thank you. I think that's
yeah, Prof. Schenk, sorry, I've been asked to wrap this up. Thank you very much again for the very interesting discussion. And if anyone has any further questions, please join the networking session at 2 p.m. And thank you very much to the audience, and thank you very much to our presenters. See you at the next session at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.
And thank you for the opportunity.
Have a good day.